Welcome to Reader Meet Writer Southern Edition featuring Beverly Bell with her new book, The Murder of Marion Miley. We hope to provide some retail therapy, entertainment, and distraction during this hour. I'm Wanda with the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. And now to today's event. Beverly Bell is an award-winning magazine and crime writer whose work has appeared in Arizona Highways, Indianapolis Monthly, Keeneland Magazine, and Kentucky Monthly. Bell is also a featured consultant in Kentucky Education Television's recent documentary, Forgotten Fame, The Marion Miley Story. Hello, Beverly. We're so glad to have you here.
Hi, thank you so much, Wanda.
Yes.
Thanks to everybody who's joining in today. I'm really happy to be here. I have an admission. When Siba first proposed this presentation idea to me, I really didn't get it. I have thought hundreds of times about Marion Miley, her life as a leading American golfer, and then, of course, her horrific death when she was only 27 years old. But had I ever thought of the story in terms of this particular vantage point, basically all the things that went wrong from in the process of this crime? No, I had never thought about that before. So it really caused me to look at the whole thing again and analyze the crime kind of step by step. And that's when I realized that the concept was spot on. How not to get away with murder. So I'm going to share with you a few lessons, things that I learned about crime while writing my book, The Murder of Marion Miley, and specifically what not to do if you're to have even a prayer of a chance to not get caught. So kind of first things first, I'm assuming that most of you aren't familiar with Marion Miley. So let me just take one quick minute to make the introduction. Okay. Sorry, there we go. So this is Marion Miley. She was one of the dominant women golfers from the mid-1930s until her murder in 1941. So how dominant was she? Well, she won virtually every amateur tournament, which is how women competed in that time. There was no professional circuit. She won virtually every amateur tournament that was available at the time. Of the 13 women who would go on to found the Ladies Professional Golf Association, the LPGA, she played 6 of them. She beat all 6. It's really appropriate that this presentation is being sponsored by SIBA, and I'm assuming that the majority of the audience with us today also from the South, because the South was very important to Marion's career. It was really her proving ground that she was a contender and that she deserved to be on the national stage. And even though the South played a pivotal role in her life, Marion was actually born in the East, in Philadelphia. These are her parents, Elsie and Fred Miley. Fred was a golf pro, and his job really required that the family moved a few times So she was born in Philadelphia, but they moved to Boston and then later to Florida, where she spent all of her childhood. When Marion was about 12, her dad taught her the game of golf. She would say later in life that there was no one that she enjoyed playing more with than her dad. Then when she was 16 and had just graduated high school, the family comes here, where Fred became the golf pro at the Lexington Country Club in Lexington, Kentucky. It's really a beautiful place, but it's also the very unfortunate site of the crime. It's where Marion's golf story begins and where her life would tragically end. So that's really the foundation. And now we can get to the real topic of our conversation, how not to get away with murder. I'm sure most of you have seen these master classes that are available online. You have these really accomplished people in all areas of expertise, people like Martin Scorsese and Serena Williams. They have Steve Martin and my personal favorite, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and they share their knowledge with an online audience. Well, if there were a master class on how to commit a crime in such a way that 99 times out of 100 you would get caught, the three men who committed, who were convicted, and ultimately executed for the murder of Marion Miley, as well as her mother, they would teach this class. So let's get to the first lesson. Talk freely about your plan to commit a crime. The plan was very simple. The three men set out to rob the Lexington Country Club. This is what the club looked like in 1941. And you're going to see a yellow arrow pointing to a second floor window. That was the real target of the robbery. That was the Miley apartment. And the three men who put this plan together to rob it, they somehow got this idea that the Mileys held on to thousands of dollars for the club over the weekend before that money could be deposited at the bank on Monday morning. So that was the goal, this apartment on the second floor. The Mileys lived there together until 1937. And in that year, Fred took a better paying job as a golf pro in Cincinnati, and Elsie and Marion continued to live there. Elsie had been named the office manager for the country club. And of course, Marion used the country club as sort of her home base in her the competitions that she was participating in around the country. Fred would come in and he would visit, like every few weeks. 2 weeks before the crime, this guy, his name was Tom Lunsford, he was asked by one of the three men planning the robbery to help in the crime. When Lunsford said no, one of the men approached another man, a friend actually, and then that person declined as well. Now, I don't know, call me crazy, but it seems to me that if you want to rob a place, the first instinct would to sort of keep that secret, keep the details to yourself. That did not happen here. It was as if they were posting the job for additional help, on ZipRecruiter.com. They were talking freely about it. And then this guy, Tom Lunsford, as well as the other man who was approached, what was their role in sort of the whole crime drama? Well, they became excellent witnesses for the prosecution after the crime had been committed. Next up, let the stupidest person in the group plan the crime. Or maybe a more appropriate title, Idiot in Charge. When I was writing the book, I came up with one adjective for each of the three men who participated, who carried off this crime. And it was kind of a shorthand for me to sort of sum up the way I came to evaluate what they were like in terms of as people. The first term was demonic. The second term was desperate. And the third term was dumb. Can you guess which term fits with this guy? I'm sorry. This is the guy who came up with the idea for the crime in the first place. This was the guy who suggested how it should be carried out. Now, I have no idea as to his actual intelligence. Supposedly, he had insider knowledge of the country club. But once you read the book, you will see early on that he had no idea what he was talking about, and he had no idea what he was doing. Related to that point is the next one. Don't bother to find out what you're walking into. Or another way of saying it, planning is overrated. As I mentioned before, there were three men who committed this crime, but only two of them actually broke in to the country club. Now, I've read all the court documents, I've read transcripts, signed confessions, newspaper articles, you name it, I've read it. And I am convinced that those two men thought that Elsie Miley, Marion's mother, and Elsie Miley alone lived in that apartment. They had no idea about Marion, none. And for the life of me, I can't figure out how that could have happened. How do you miss something so important? And there's just no explanation for it. It just becomes one of many things that don't add up. Next thing up, make sure as many people as possible see you the night of the crime. Now, I can understand in some circumstances where you would want people to see you. It might help establish an alibi, but that wasn't the case here. The crime was committed in Lexington, and the man who pulled the trigger and murdered Marion as well as her mother was from Louisville, 70 miles away from Lexington. It would not make sense in any universe for him to be showing his face, which he did. He visited several bars. He wasn't trying to hide what he was doing, who he was with. And he did that just hours before the shooting. Here's something else he did. This is a drugstore that was located in downtown Lexington. And so the three guys had decided that they were going to cut the power of the country club before they broke in. But then I guess one of them sort of woke up and said, okay, if there's no power and there are no lights, we better have a flashlight so we can see where we're going. So about an hour before they were to drive out to the country club and commit this crime, one of them stopped at this drugstore on Main Street in Lexington to buy a flashlight. Now, the thing that, one of the really interesting details is that the clerk who worked in this drugstore, he had only been on the job just a few weeks. And so when the man came in asking to buy a flashlight, this clerk didn't know where the flashlights were. He had to sort of look around the store and figure it out. So when the police came by later after the crime, the clerk not only vividly remembered selling a flashlight the night of the crime, really shortly before the drugstore closed, but then he also remembered what the man looked like who had purchased it. Another mistake, bring friends along for the fun of it. Remember this guy? He was supposed to meet up with his partners in crime earlier in the evening, and he does. He shows up at the appointed time, but he brings friends along in his car. Just sort of let that sink in. These people had nothing to do with the crime. They had no knowledge of it. They would have no role in it, but they became very important to investigating detectives afterwards because they had details about people meeting up and what these people looked like and what kind of car they drove. They were also just key in testimony during the actual trials. So how else does somebody not get away with murder? They ignore all the warning signs at the site of the crime. The men who perpetrated this expected one person to be at the country club that night, and that was Elsie Miley, Marion's mother. And they also expected only one car in the parking lot. But when they arrived, there was a second car, and this was Marion's car. She had just purchased it 2.5 months earlier. She referred to it as her baby, which I loved reading about. And of course, she parks in the parking lot of the country club because she lives there. So it just seems to me that a normal person, if they were trying to carry off this robbery, they would have said, hey, wait a minute, whose car is this? Is the person still here? Should we wait? Should we not rob the place because maybe a second person is here? But apparently none of that happened. Something else, draw attention to yourself at the crime. This is one of my favorite parts. Look at this kid. He was 17 years old. He was a newspaper delivery boy, and the Lexington Country Club was part of his newspaper route. There early morning, Sunday morning, when this happened, he was delivering his papers just like he always did. Gets to the country club, and he sees something that just does not look right. Don't want to tell you exactly what it is, but it was something that turned out to be so vitally important in solving this case. Now, for the life of me, I can't figure out why did the men doing this crime allow this to be seen? Were they careless? Were they just so arrogant that they thought that they were going to get away with this no matter what? Who knows? We don't know what the answer is. But we do know that this kid, his name was Hugh Kramer, with his cute little wire-rimmed glasses and his baby face, he proved that it's important when you just pay attention to the details, even if you are incredibly young. Next thing not to do is to pick a fight with someone who will fight back. You don't become one of the leading women golfers by backing down, and that was certainly true for Marion. She was a born athlete. She was tall and she was strong, and golf was only one thing that she did really well. Turned out to be a terrific horsewoman. The men who broke into the club, they expected this older woman, the only person who they would meet, Elsie Miley. But instead, they confronted Marion. Marion, who had been playing highly competitive golf in the nation and in the world for 10 years. Somebody who knew how to take a very strong and powerful swing at a golf club. Somebody who never held back. Somebody who was a fighter. And she fought that night as well. Another mistake. If you're the perpetrator of a crime, be sure to sustain an injury so serious it will require medical attention. I'm not going to tell you how, but I will tell you that when this guy broke into the country club that night, Marion hurt him. She didn't shoot him, she didn't stab him, she didn't hit him over the head with a golf club. But she inflicted such a serious wound, something that would actually become a point of evidence, that he had to get medical treatment for 5 days in a row. And this injury became an unusual aspect that contributed to his conviction. And, the best thing of all is that he never saw it coming. And perhaps, I guess, the biggest mistake of all is be sure and murder somebody really, really famous. This was the New York Times headline the day after Marion was murdered. It was front page, top of the fold. You can see it's the second story there on the left. Her death was reported all over the world. And why? Because she was known all over the world. And it wasn't just in athletic circles. Marion also knew all kinds of celebrities. In her diary, she talks about meeting the former British king, Prince Edward, and his wife, Wallis Simpson. Marion played golf with Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, two of the biggest stars of the first half of the 20th century. Crosby here on the left is reportedly gave thousands of dollars to a reward fund to try and find her killers. This next person, you may not recognize her face, but you will certainly recognize her last name. This is Madame Renee Lacoste. She was an athlete in her own right. She was also the wife of Renee Lacoste, who was the founder of the iconic brand that we all know. Marion knew her and, in fact, had beaten her in an exhibition match in Paris. Marion was friends with politicians and athletes and business leaders and socialites, but the men who broke into the apartment that night had no idea who she was and had no idea the fury that they would unleash in murdering her. So I hope you've had some fun learning a few of these fun facts, I guess, about the mistakes that were made the night of the crime. My book takes a very different approach, mainly because the essence of the story of Marion is just one of unbelievable accomplishment and unimaginable heartbreak. Thinking about what could have been, what should have been, if she hadn't been killed so young. And it's also about understanding so many people who who suffered just tremendous loss when she died, people who loved her and actually would never be the same again after her death. I hope at some point you'll read the book and enjoy it. And again, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Beverly. That was fascinating. It's time for questions. It's important you stay muted so we can all hear the answers. In the chat option, please begin your questions with a capital Q and name your local bookstore if you'd like, and we'll give them a shout out. Linda Marie, do we have a question for Beverly?
We do. Fans of both writing books on St. Simon's Island and novel in Memphis, Tennessee, ask, how did you discover this story?
From somebody telling me a really interesting story. It was years ago, and it was actually my late father-in-law. I had just started doing some magazine writing, and he told me this story one day about this famous golfer who had lived in Lexington. It was, Lexington was his hometown, and he had been a boy when she really started coming onto the national stage. He was very much aware of her. And then he was only like 16 or so when she was murdered. And you could tell it was just something that had really stuck with him. And then when he told me the story, and I did about this much research on it, I was also hooked because it was riveting to me.
A fan of Copperfish Books in Punta Gorda, Florida, asks whether the men who committed the crime had criminal histories.
Yes, 2 of the 3 did. The man who actually pulled the trigger and killed both women, he had the worst record. He and one of the other men had served time together, and that's how they met each other. The third one, which is our Mr. Brilliant, he had done a lot of like marginal things. It was kind of on the edge, but he had never served any time. But yes, they 2 of the 3 definitely had records.
Another fan of Copperfish Books in Punta Gorda, Florida, asks, did you need permission from Marion Miley's estate to write the book?
I did not. Marion was an only child, and so she and her mother died as a result of this crime. Her father remarried, had no other children, and he died in the 50s. That was one aspect of the story that required a lot of thinking on my part, and I guess imagination, because virtually every person associated with this story had already passed away. And so it really required me to imagine, to kind of get into people's heads and figure out how they would have felt and how they would have responded. And I was very fortunate that I had a lot of resources to do that. But no, I did not have to get any kind of permission.
Regarding the resources, how did you research the book and how long did that take you?
Okay, now you're really getting into my secrets here in terms of the length. Okay, so I've obviously known about the story for a long time. Doesn't mean that I was working on it, all that. But in addition to the public documents, like I subscribe to, various newspaper archives, which was very helpful. She was a national figure, so that was really fun to be able to read stories in the newspaper about her wins and her tournaments. I also had all the copies of transcripts of the trials, including the appeals. I was given a very rare opportunity. One of the men who committed the crime, he wrote in excess of 70 letters from prison while he was awaiting execution to his mother. And I was allowed to read those letters. If you've read the book or are planning to read it, you will see that the story is told from 3 perspectives. It's told from Marion's best friend, it's told from her father, and the 3rd perspective is one of the men who committed the crime. And this man, whose letters that I read really informed that. But I also was given some private documents by some extended members of the family to read and learn from. We also had something 9 months before Marion's death. She put together scrapbooks of all her accomplishments. She had saved them all up, and I guess she hadn't organized them. And she finished that in December of 1940. And then, of course, she was murdered in September of 1941. She talks about in her diary how her back was just breaking as she was finished putting all these newspaper clippings into the scrapbooks. You can kind of see her just bent over. So I was able, I had a lot of resources to put this book together.
Without giving away anything to those who haven't read the book yet, were there any big surprises while researching? Or maybe things that didn't make it into the book?
Well, I'll give you one thing that did not make it into the book, but again, it did inform the way I wrote it. Another unique opportunity that I had was I got to meet the sister of Fred Miley's second wife. Fred Miley was Marion's father. He remarried. Unfortunately, I did not ever get to meet the second wife. But I got to meet the sister who lived down in Florida. I can't tell you how important the state of Florida is to this story. I felt like I was just living down there. That's a little side piece. So I've done a lot of writing assignments, and I was sent down to Naples to do a story, and made a side trip to visit the sister of the second wife. And she told me that before Fred would agree to marry the second wife, who was considerably younger than he made her promise that there would be no children, and said he wouldn't marry her unless she agreed to no children, because in her words, he could not go through that pain again if something were to happen to that child. And honestly, it just broke my heart when she told me that story. But that was, it really puts, flesh on the bones. You're living in this world of black and white photographs and old newspaper stories. And sometimes people in the past, they just stop feeling real, like they don't have the same emotions or they don't go through the same struggles. And I hear a story like that and it becomes incredibly real to me, and the just the extreme pain that some of these people were going through. And then I have to say, I've spent so much time researching the 30s because that was the height of Marion's career. That's when she was really moving up the ladder. And it's like the 30s and all its economic challenges. Now, of course, we're in a totally different situation, but we have suffered economic ramifications. And, it just, I've heard some things lately and I just go, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm back in my 30s research again.
Mm-hmm. A fan of Novel in Memphis asks, are you a golfer? Did you already have an interest in golf?
I am a golfer. I did already have an interest. I think that's honestly, that was part of the reason why my father-in-law told me the story. But I don't want to misrepresent. I'm nowhere close to her. She's at a whole new level, whole different level. But absolutely, you know, I loved reading and learning about these women. Honestly, it was such a unique time for women golfers in the 30s because there was this gap. Like Bobby Jones, iconic Bobby Jones, had retired from the game, and there was this perfect window of opportunity for the women to step in, and you just have no idea how popular the women's game was in the 30s. And it was just great. It was great seeing it, and it was great seeing the role that these women would play in laying down a foundation for what would become a professional golf circuit for women.
Linda Marie, we have time for one more question.
Okay. What are you currently working on?
Something very dark and something not too much fun, because it's a struggle. Isn't it always a struggle? I don't know. I'll get through it. It's requiring a lot of research, which I do love, but this is a whole different research. It's a different time period in the 1960s, and we'll see how it goes.
Thank you, Beverly. And thank you, everyone. This was wonderful. And if you enjoyed, it, let your bookstore know by ordering Beverly's book. Be in touch with your bookstore with any suggestions for how we can make this better for you. And order The Murder of Marion Miley from them. They'll be very grateful. And thanks to Linda Marie and Nikki, and this is Wanda signing off.